Listen carefully, because the next 8 seconds were never meant to reach your ears. There is a name whispered in the archives of the Old South, a name that surfaces only when men let their lanterns burn too low and their fear turns honest. They say there was a woman who could rewrite a child's past the way a banker rewrites ledgers. A woman who purchased little girls at 10, erased their bloodlines by 11, and sold them as wives at 14. Some call her a madam. Some call her a trafficker. Yet the men who truly understood her, those who profited from her, called her something much colder. The finisher. You are about to learn why. But before we proceed, understand this. Once you hear the truth behind her operation, the world you thought you lived in will fracture. Because this is not merely a story about slavery or the sins of a nation. No, this is about systems built in shadows. Systems older than cotton and blood. Systems that turn innocence into currency and identity into a manufacturable product. And she, Celestine Vacherie, was only one of its many architects. Her empire began in 1829, inside a shuttered 2-story house on Britannia Street in New Orleans. To the neighbors, it looked abandoned, jasmine overgrown, oleander twisting like veins across the gate, windows sealed as though to keep something inside or to keep something out. But at night, faint lamplight flickered through the cracks, and occasionally, on mist-heavy evenings, a child's voice could be heard reciting something that didn't sound like a lesson, but an oath. Celestine's academy did not teach reading or writing or manners. It taught transformation, erasure, the ritual dismantling of a childhood so completely that no trace of the original identity remained. She believed a girl could be broken and rebuilt the way iron could be heated, hammered, and shaped so long as the fire was hot enough and the blows deliberate. Where she learned these methods, no one knows. Some say from European finishing schools. Some whisper from a Creole order of women who specialized in silent daughters, children repurposed for the households of men who needed wives without histories. Other accounts describe Celestine attending secret gatherings in Charleston's back alleys where plantation elites exchanged more than cotton futures. They exchanged people. But her genius, her true, monstrous brilliance was simple. She did not sell girls. She sold identities. And once an identity is rewritten, a man's control over that life becomes absolute. By the time Celestine Vacherie acquired her first 3 girls, the house on Britannia Street had already begun to shift, almost as if it were awakening. Neighbors claimed the shutters seemed to move positions between dawn and dusk, though no one ever saw them open. Others swore that when Celestine walked past, stray dogs lowered themselves to the ground, ears flat, as if recognizing a predator cloaked in human skin. But the girls sensed something deeper. Not a haunting no, something far colder. Design. Celestine believed a child could be remade through 3 pillars: isolation, instruction, and inversion. Isolation severed all ties to the past. Instruction installed a new persona. But inversion was the ritual she used to ensure obedience. It was the psychological turning of a soul inside out. It began the moment a girl entered the maison de grâce. Celestine would stand before her, silent, evaluating. She did not look at the child's face, she studied her posture, her breathing, the micro-expressions that revealed terror, confusion, defiance. She didn't ask questions. She simply said one thing in French, her tone soft but sharpened with command. What you were is gone. Now we decide who you will be. The girls were stripped not just of clothing, but of name, dialect, memory. Celestine burned their garments not out of cruelty, but symbolism. In her mind, ash was the purest form of rebirth. She forbade them from speaking their birth names. If one slipped, she received an hour locked in a windowless room where the darkness was so complete that time had no meaning. The room was the first lesson. When the world forgets you, you must forget the world. Then came the instruction. The mornings were needlework, finger-pricking, bone-tightening stitching designed not to create beauty but precision. By noon, the girls were managing ledgers, learning the language of household economics, practicing poise, memorizing the genealogies of prominent families. They learned how to stand without fidgeting, how to smile without sincerity, how to answer without revealing anything true. But the real work began at night. Celestine called it the quieting. She would bring a single girl into the dim parlor, sit inches from her, and speak lies with the conviction of scripture. You were born immobile. Your parents died of fever. You are grateful for the life I've given you. She repeated these until the girl began whispering them back. This was inversion, the moment a child's own mind no longer trusted its memories. But there was a deeper reason for this ritual one Celestine never documented. She believed these girls were vessels. Not spiritually, economically, socially. They were instruments in a hidden marketplace where power demanded perfect obedience cloaked in innocence. And obedience, she believed, was easiest to carve into the very young. By 1831, the Maison de Grace no longer felt like a home. It had become an engine, an apparatus built for one purpose: to convert children into commodities disguised as brides. And every machine requires fuel. For Celestine, that fuel was secrecy. She purchased girls with the precision of a merchant selecting rare materials. She sought light skin, malleable temperament, and a particular stillness in the eyes, the stillness of someone who had already learned that resistance brings punishment. But Celestine didn't merely choose girls who were useful. She chose girls who could vanish without consequence. And the South was full of such children. At auctions in Charleston, Savannah, and Mobile, she appeared under different aliases. In Richmond, she was Madame de Roche. In Wilmington, she was Mrs. Grenville. In Charleston, she was a widow from Barbados. Auctioneers whispered about her. Not because she spent lavishly, she didn't, but because she bought only girls between 8 and 10. Never older, never younger, never boys. Her criteria were so precise it bordered on ritual. And perhaps it was. Some historians believe Celestine was simply tapping into the cruel economics of the era. But others, those who have studied the sealed testimonies, the coded letters, the documents 3 governors tried to bury, believe she was part of something older. A network operating beneath plantation society, older than the Confederacy, older than American slavery itself. A lineage of women who turned children into acceptable wives, for men whose power demanded companions with no families, no inheritance, no past. If this network existed, Celestine was its most refined practitioner. Back in New Orleans, the transformation process deepened. The girls studied etiquette until their gestures were indistinguishable from those of plantation daughters. They memorized fabricated family trees. They practiced speaking about dead parents with tremors in their voices and downcast eyes. They learned to laugh softly, to walk gracefully, to weep convincingly. But the most disturbing part was how they learned to disappear emotionally. Celestine taught them that trust was a vulnerability, that revealing anything true could destroy the life she was building for them. She convinced them that their survival depended entirely on obedience, silence, and the performance of gratitude. And for children with no protectors, her logic worked. Claire Deveau, formerly Celia, became proof of concept. At 14, she could pass as the daughter of an impoverished, respectable family. Her skin tone, once a marker of enslavement, was now Creole elegance. Her silence, once fear, was modesty. Her trauma, once inflicted, now carefully packaged as refinement. But what made Claire valuable wasn't her appearance. It was her emptiness. An empty past, an empty history, an identity Celestine could sell to any man willing to pay. And men were waiting. By 1833, rumors of Celestine Vachery's academy had drifted through the parlors and cigar rooms of New Orleans like cigar smoke, thin, fragrant, and deniable. Men of new wealth, anxious to secure respectability, began making discreet inquiries. Not to Celestine directly, never that. They spoke to lawyers, clerks, priests, brokers. Men who understood that in the South, the most valuable transactions were never written, only whispered. This was the part of history no textbook ever prints. There existed a shadow market not for slaves, nor for land, but for wives. Wives with no lineage to compete with, no uncles demanding inheritance, no questions, no claims, no roots. Wives who appeared refined, cultured, grateful, and above all controllable. Men didn't purchase these girls for companionship. They purchased them for containment. A wife with no bloodline could not destabilize a man's estate. She could not challenge him socially. She could not claim children from another branch. She could not threaten legacy. She existed only because he bought her and therefore could disappear with equal convenience. Celestine's role in this system was not incidental. It was essential. She acted as the finisher, the final link in a very old chain. Families with wealth but no pedigree needed brides. Girls with beauty but no protection needed identities. Celestine supplied both. She forged baptismal records. She wrote fake letters from imaginary relatives. She constructed entire genealogies and trained the girls to recite them like scripture. But behind the etiquette, behind the embroidery, behind the posture lessons and fictitious family histories, her true training was psychological. She sculpted obedience the way a sculptor carves marble slowly, meticulously, without mercy. Claire Deveau, her first masterpiece, was nearly ready. But before Celestine sold her, she needed to test the final requirement: the girl's capacity to vanish. Not physically, socially, emotionally. Celestine needed to ensure the girl could endure being seen and not recognized, spoken to and not known, loved and yet never asked questions. So she began a ritual the girls called the walk. One by one, she took them outside the walls, not far, only to the edge of the garden, where the iron gates cast latticework shadows across the dirt. She made them stand in silence as neighbors passed. Their task was to remain invisible even when seen, to blend into a space they had never been part of. Most children fidgeted or trembled. Claire did not. She stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from obedience and loss. Celestine smiled. The finisher had done her work well, and the buyers were already on their way. By the spring of 1834, the Maison de Grace was no longer a secret, it was a destination. Not publicly, not legally, not in any way a man could admit in daylight. But in the coded murmurs of counting rooms, in the back pews of churches where wives couldn't overhear, in the tobacco-thick air of gentlemen's clubs, Celestine Vacherie had become a quiet solution to a loud problem. How does a man with wealth but no lineage secure a future that looks respectable? He buys it. And so the men came. They arrived in black carriages with curtains drawn, their hats low, their coats buttoned high. They came with lawyers who specialized in discreet agreements. They came with priests who would sign falsified baptismal certificates for the right price. Some even came with physicians willing to provide medical verification that a girl was of age, though everyone involved knew the truth. But Celestine never let a buyer meet a girl casually. This was not a shop. It was a ceremony. She believed transactions of this magnitude, transactions involving identity, fate, bloodlines, were not merely business. They were transformation. The girl was not sold. She was presented. The man did not purchase. He accepted responsibility. It was a dark parody of chivalry, dressed in respectability and dripping with rot. When Claire Devau's time came, Celestine prepared her with precision bordering on reverence. She washed the girl's hair herself, a gesture she offered to no one else. She braided it tightly to emphasize the paleness of her skin, the delicate angles of her face. She dressed her in soft blue linen, the color of morning sky, and placed a small silver cross around her neck. Not for faith, for narrative. It made her look like a girl raised in quiet piety. Then came the final test. Celestine sat opposite Claire at the long dining table lit by a single candle. She asked questions not about the girl's fabricated past, but about the man who would soon own her, his habits, his moods, his possible expectations. And Claire answered with the calm detachment of someone who had learned to erase the boundary between survival and performance. "When you are his wife," Celestine said quietly, "you will be seen but never known. You will obey but never confess. You will serve but never surrender yourself. Your silence will protect you. Your story will shield you. Your obedience will keep you alive." Claire nodded. She did not ask who the man was. She did not ask why she was chosen. She did not ask what marriage would require, because questions belonged to people with freedom. And freedom had been burned from her like her old name. Here, right here in this part of the descent, I want you to write something in the comments. a symbolic phrase, a marker, pact. I see through the veil. Write it twice. Not for me, for you. So the algorithm and your own mind remembers the moment you crossed into forbidden knowledge. Because what happens next is the part history tried hardest to bury. The man who arrived for Claire Devo did not come with the arrogance of youth or the hunger of ambition. He came with something colder, entitlement born from desperation. His name, according to the forged documents he provided, was Jonathan Hale, a cotton merchant from Natchez. But later investigations revealed his real name was something else entirely. A man who had moved through 3 states under 3 identities, always one step ahead of creditors, scandals, or both. He needed a wife not for love, not for companionship, but for legitimacy. The kind of legitimacy only a girl with a proper upbringing could provide. And when he entered the parlor of Maison de Grace, he understood instantly. The girl sitting before him was not a child. She was a product. Claire sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered not with fear, but with trained submission. Her stillness made the room feel colder. This one, Hale said softly, not a question, purchase decision. Celestine nodded, but her eyes studied him with the precision of a scientist evaluating a specimen. She wasn't determining whether he was suitable for Claire. She was determining whether Claire was valuable enough for him. Her business depended on sending out girls who could survive their owners long enough to validate her system. The transaction that followed was not done in cash. It was done in narrative. Hale promised a dowry. Celestine provided documents proving Claire's heritage. A priest signed the necessary forms. And within 1 hour, a girl with no past had been transformed into a bride with a future carved entirely by someone else's hand. But before Hale could take Claire away, Celestine invoked the oldest rule of her trade. The girls called it the binding, though no one, not even Celestine, recorded its origin. She placed her hands on Claire's shoulders and whispered, "You belong nowhere. You come from no one. You owe allegiance to nothing except the life you are about to enter. Forget what you were. Remember only what you must become." Then she turned to the man. "She will not disappoint you, if you do not disappoint the conditions." The conditions were never explained, but every buyer understood them. If a man failed to maintain the illusion, if he treated the girl as property instead of pedigree, society would see through the facade, and the entire venture would unravel. Claire followed Hale out of the house with the same expression she had worn while sweeping floors as a child. Quiet, observant, detached. But outside the gates, something shifted. She looked back only once at the shuttered windows of Maison de Grace. The walls that had erased her. The woman who had rebuilt her. The home that had been a prison masquerading as salvation. It was the first and last time Claire ever disobeyed an instruction. And though Celestine never admitted it, she noticed. What happened next proved why these girls tended to vanish within 3 years. Because the finishing was only the beginning. The Fairfax estate had many forbidden wings, sealed basements, steel-locked attics, corridors neither mapped nor mentioned, but none were as terrifying, or as carefully erased from public memory, as the White Room. It looked harmless at first. A rectangular chamber, painted floor to ceiling in blinding white lime, with no windows and no corners. The Fairfax architects had intentionally curved every edge so the human eye couldn't anchor itself to anything. A person inside lost all sense of depth, shape, and spatial awareness. Time didn't pass normally in there. Thought didn't behave normally either. But the walls weren't plain. They hummed. Not loudly, not softly, perfectly. A frequency so precise that early medical examiners said it bypassed the ears and went directly into the brainstem. A hum designed to agitate the survival centers of the mind, just enough to break a man open, not enough to kill him. The Fairfax family called it cognitive tuning. Victims called it something else, torture. The Fairfax family believed that control wasn't earned through violence, it was engineered. They discovered that if you denied a human being sensory stability long enough, their mind would dissolve and then reform around whoever offered structure. That whoever was always a Fairfax. Inside the White Room, a subject would lose the ability to track time after 90 minutes. begin hallucinating voices after 3 hours, forget their own name after 5 hours, and by 8 hours, they would attach themselves emotionally to the first stable figure they saw upon release. That figure was typically Patriarch Elias Fairfax, or one of his trained successors. To escape the panic, subjects bonded to him on a primal level. Not loyalty, not respect, dependency, and once dependency was formed, the Fairfaxes could make a man betray anyone, his brother, his wife, his God, simply by withdrawing that stability again. This wasn't interrogation. This was reprogramming. Local townspeople believed the missing workers were runaways, drifters, or gamblers escaping debt. Few realized they were actually being funneled into Fairfax experiments brought in at night by charity wagons that supposedly offered food to the poor. Most of them never left. Those who did were never the same. One survivor, found wandering barefoot along the old riverbank in 1931, was unable to speak a single word. Doctors assumed trauma, but his throat was perfectly healthy. His mind wasn't. When finally stabilized, he wrote on a scrap of envelope, "The room is white, but the voice is black." After that, he never wrote again. His identity was confirmed only after 3 weeks. His wife identified him. His children didn't recognize him. What no one outside the family knew was this: the White Room wasn't an isolated chamber. It was a prototype, a model, a design later copied quietly, invisibly into multiple institutions the Fairfaxes advised, funded, or controlled: military training modules, private psychiatric facilities, experimental juvenile correction programs, elite political leadership camps, and, most chillingly, the sound frequency itself would reappear decades later in classified research linked to early behavior modification programs. Programs that still officially don't exist. But the Fairfax family kept the original room, kept it pristine, kept it functional, because the White Room wasn't built to punish the past. It was built to shape the future. Before the White Room was perfected for adults, the Fairfax family needed a different kind of subject. One whose identity had not yet hardened, whose mind had not yet fully formed, whose sense of self could be rebuilt from the foundation up. They needed children, and they knew exactly where to find them. The orphanage built on a lie. In 1894, the Fairfaxes funded a sprawling hilltop institution known publicly as Blackridge Home for Lost Children, a charitable refuge for abandoned boys and girls. But locals who lived close enough to hear the night wind swore it had another name whispered among the staff. The nursery. Not a nursery for babies. A nursery for subjects. Children were brought in from every corner of the county. Orphans, runaways, the unwanted, the inconvenient. Paperwork vanished. Names were reassigned. Birth records quietly rewritten. Once a child entered Blackridge, they didn't exist anywhere else. In the daytime they played. At night they were tested. During the day, Blackridge looked like any other Victorian orphanage. Children running in the courtyard. Teachers leading hymns. Nurses spooning soup into tiny mouths. Volunteers knitting blankets for the dear little ones. It was a performance, staged for visitors and donors. But at night, after the lanterns dimmed and the doors bolted, the Blackridge children were moved in small groups into the building's hidden lower wings. There, they were placed in modified white rooms. Smaller, quieter, calibrated to a child's nervous system. Not to torture, to condition. The Fairfaxes wanted to know: how early can loyalty be engineered? How young can a mind be shaped? How deep can obedience be carved before the child even knows what rebellion means? Some children broke within hours, some within days, and some, those the Fairfax elders called the gifted, didn't break at all. They molded perfectly. The children who never cried. There were certain children who terrified even the medical technicians. Children who emerged from the White Room, silent, calm, smiling faintly, staring with unervingly steady eyes. They didn't ask for comfort. They didn't ask for food. They didn't even ask where they were. Instead, they waited, still patient, attentive, for the Fairfax handlers to speak, to give instructions, to approve, to command. The researchers documented these children with clinical fascination. Subject 14A demonstrates total emotional flattening, yet shows heightened obedience. Presence no resistance, no fear, no hesitation. A perfect blank slate. These perfect slates eventually became the most valuable resource the Fairfax family ever produced. They weren't adopted. They weren't released. They were placed into schools, into churches, into political offices, into federal programs, into roles where influence was subtle, but power was guaranteed to grow. Blackridge Orphanage was never about helping children. It was about planting seeds. Publicly, Blackridge was shut down in 1919 due to funding limitations. Privately, it was closed because of a scandal that almost exposed everything. A state inspector arrived unannounced. Documents later uncovered revealed he cataloged something shocking. There were 72 fewer children in the building than the official records listed. The orphanage staff claimed clerical errors, adoptions, placement transfers, but the inspector wasn't convinced. 3 days later, he disappeared. His report disappeared. And 2 weeks later, his replacement signed off that Blackridge was fully compliant. The missing children were never found. But the Fairfax family didn't lose them. They simply moved them into their estates, into their academies, into their long-term programs, and into positions where influence could be applied silently, invisibly, generationally. Blackridge was the first harvest. There would be many more.